Hello everyone, Brian here, and welcome back to another episode of Nerd Theater. Today's a special day because a sequel to a long-awaited movie has just recently come out. In preparation for that and in celebration of that even, I decided to dress up today. Some of you might not recognize this costume, but I'm supposed to be Rick Deckard from Blade Runner 2049. So, after a long period of time, the unexpected and, as some would say, kind of unnecessary sequel to Blade Runner just hit theaters, and it's called Blade Runner 2049. Now, I feel like a little background might be necessary before I start this whole review, but essentially, Blade Runner is a 80s sci-fi film directed by Ridley Scott. It has a lot of film noir elements in it, very harsh shadows, very beautiful cinematography, and if you break it down as simply as possible, it's pretty much a detective story set in the year 2019. So it's pretty far in the future. But essentially, this new film is very much a very similar setup. So let me get started by saying I do really love Blade Runner. I recognize it as a great film. It's one of my favorite movies, and there's many people who recognize it as a masterpiece. There's a huge cult following for it now. It's critically acclaimed. While it didn't do too well at the box office when it first came out, it has definitely now found its audience. Um, and then there are a lot of people who think it's the most boring movie ever made. But all in all, people do recognize that it's visually amazing, thematically astounding. It inspired a whole, genre of cyberpunk, whether it be in movies, TV, video games, etc. So there is a lot riding on this sequel, and as a lot of people recognize Blade Runner for being a good movie, there's just as many recognizing it for being a very slow and boring movie. And while I don't necessarily find it boring, I never really have, I will admit it is slow, so I can definitely see why people would see it to be kind of, uninteresting or kind of bland. Uh, so when you see Blade Runner 2049 coming out with a near 3 hour runtime. I think it's about 2 hours and 43 minutes. You're kind of left kind of scratching your head can they pull this off? And while I will say the pace of this movie is extremely slow, uh, it is just as investing and engaging as the original. So I know it's pretty high praise coming off right at the bat, but I just had to kind of get that off my chest, let you guys know just simply what I thought about the movie. So let's go dive in a little deeper. Blade Runner 2049 takes place a whole 30 years after the original movie, as the title suggests. But basically, Ryan Gosling is playing a character named Kay, and he's basically taking the reins, and he's the main character now. So he's driving this new franchise, similar to something like Force Awakens, where the baton is kind of being passed down to a younger generation. Now, I don't think and I don't hope that this movie spawns a franchise. I doubt it will, considering that it's not doing too well at the box office, unfortunately. But I don't think that was really the plan from the get-go. Starting out, I was skeptical about this film. A lot of people were, but it was kind of put at ease, at least slightly, when people all around the world saw that, what's his name? Denis Villeneuve, was taking the reins for this movie as director. So a lot of people were kind of put at ease by that, just because he's a very talented director. A lot of people kind of recognize him as one of the best modern filmmakers of this age. And I will say he is great. I haven't seen a bad movie from him yet. Granted, I haven't seen all his stuff. There's a few left untouched. I haven't seen Enemy, but I've seen most of his other movies. So he's kind of this really talented director. He has a strong vision. And his movies usually have some sort of emotional impact. Like, for example, I thought Prisoners and Arrival, just from last year, are great. So he's banging out these movies every single year, and so far they've all managed to be really great. So definitely props to him for that alone. But also, another thing that kind of put people at ease, it kind of raised expectations, was the fact that Roger Deakins was going to be behind the camera. So, as everyone pretty much knows, Blade Runner from '82 is a very beautiful film, visually astounding, has some great cinematography, which is beautiful, still great to watch. And even people who recognize it as not a great movie will still say that yes, it's beautiful. So with Roger Deakins taking the wheel for this new film, I think a lot of people are like, okay, so at least they're getting they're getting talented people behind the camera to do this. They have Harrison Ford back. It looks like it's going to be a strong continuation, and if it's not, at least it'll look good. So that's kind of my expectations going into this movie. That it might be okay. I don't know. It might be good. At least it'll look pretty is basically where I was at. I didn't want to set my expectations too high because, again, we are in the age of endless sequels, remakes, and reboots where pretty much every movie under the sun has been remade, and usually not to great effect. Sometimes you'll get a good one out there, but I will say Blade Runner 2049 managed to kind of break the mold for that kind of cliche and stand out as a legitimately great film, not only as a sequel, but as a standalone film. So yeah, jumping into the story, basically follows Ryan Gosling's character, Kay, who is a detective. He's a Blade Runner, and he's basically assigned with a mission to find a child who was basically birthed by a replicant and a human, or a replicant. It's kind of left unanswered whether or not it's a replicant or human. You'll basically have to find out for yourself to see. But yeah, essentially it's a baby born from a replicant. So they're questioning whether it's an advanced replicant, why it had a kid, why it was able to have a kid. So it's basically Ryan Gosling's job to hunt this kid down and, kill him or retire them, as they say in the movie. So yeah, that's obviously a lot to carry on his chest. It's kind of a heavy mission for him. So yeah, that's basically the plot of the movie. There's not much to it. I mean, there is some complexities. It jumps around a bit more than the first one. The first one was kind of, predictable. Some people had a complaint about that because it does classify itself as a film noir or a mystery. Detective film at least, and I will say, yeah, it's not very mysterious. There's not a lot left unsaid except the whole, Deckard is a replicant thing, or is he not? And then, of course, the great ending with Rutger Hauer's character. That came as a surprise, what he does at the end. But there's nothing really, left in the shadows. It's pretty much what's going to happen as soon as the film starts, which I thought worked for that movie because I looked at it more as a suspense than a mystery, but I digress. I will say this movie, Blade Runner 2049, is a detective movie. It is a mystery. It relies on that a lot more, which I really enjoyed because the first one really didn't do. I mean, you could argue it was intentional, you could argue it was unintentional suspense, but I will say this movie does the mystery really, really well. I was engaged pretty much the whole time. The runtime is a little long. There are parts that maybe will, keep some people, kind of bored. But one of the best things this movie does is having strong atmosphere. Whenever they change location, you really get the feel that you're there. And I just saw it at my local theater, but I imagine people who were lucky enough to experience this in IMAX got an really immersive experience, which I do hope to do at one point, but we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, no, pretty much any time there was a location change, you really got the feeling that you were there. They do a great job with sound design. The cinematography, like I said before, is astounding. And there's a lot of silence in this movie, which kind of surprised me. Everyone knows Blade Runner, the original, for its, kind of symphonic, really beautiful sci-fi-esque soundtrack, or score by Vangelis. It's one of my personal favorite soundtrack or scores from any movie. But this one doesn't really use music as much. I mean, when it does, it's great. But it doesn't utilize it as much. It doesn't feel like a crutch, really. They use a lot of silence, which I loved because, again, it sets the atmosphere and it kind of shows kind of bravery, kind of confidence in Denis Villeneuve's vision that he was, so confident that he was able to tackle this project and he wasn't afraid to use large moments of silence because there's a lot of those moments in here where you're just kind of there with the character exploring the atmosphere, and I thought it was great. It might be a complaint with some people, but I thought from a visual standpoint and a thematic standpoint what they were trying to accomplish, they nailed it. Harrison Ford, despite being in this movie, despite being on the posters and all the advertising, is not really present in this movie as much as you would think, which I liked a lot because Ryan Gosling is without a doubt the main character of this film. Harrison Ford is more of a supporting character who doesn't come in till much later, so I like that too. He, very much like the music, isn't a crutch in this movie. They weren't like, hey, look what we have, look who we have, look at this, do you remember all this? I know a lot of things these remakes tend to do, or sequels tend to do, is rely on nostalgia and stuff that you've seen before to kind of bring you back to a time of when you might have seen that original. But no, this movie takes itself very seriously. It tells its own story, and I commend it for that. It's a really brave thing to do, to kind of to tell your own story, I guess, is a brave thing to do when you're making a remake. But yeah, so I thought that was a strong improvement. The more reliance on mystery, the cinematography, obviously great, very inspired by the first one, so you have to give props to the original. But this new one did a lot of new things. I like how it jumped around to new locations. It kind of gave it, different vibes, different tones. It wasn't all in this dark and drab city, which, yes, I like in the original, but when you're having a very long, epic movie, I think it kind of helps to go to these new locations, especially when you have someone as visually astounding as Roger Deakins behind the camera. So I think it really benefited them to have those varying locations, and it makes for really interesting atmosphere. So yeah, atmosphere is definitely one of this film's strongest suits, and the storytelling was a noticeable improvement because the first film kind of relied on more of suspense, mystery, and visuals. Most people say the strongest point of the original was the visuals, but the story that 2049 tells is very engaging. So I stated it before, but it relies a lot on emotional value too, because the story itself is kind of simple. The really big part you find complexities in is the characters themselves, like Ryan Gosling's character Kay and his love interest. The love interest and romance worked extremely well in this movie. One of people's biggest complaints about the first one was that Harrison Ford and Sean Young's relationship didn't feel very genuine, which I think kind of contributed to the fact that those two did not get along well on set, apparently. So they were kind of butting heads the whole time. And I thought the romance worked fine. I don't think it was the strongest aspect of the film by any means, but I will say this movie had a much stronger improvement on that. You could really feel the connection between these two characters, which is kind of ironic because of what they did with one or two of the characters, which I'm not sure is a spoiler or not. So I'll just keep it, under the radar. But yeah, no, the romance in this movie really worked for me. The connection between the characters really worked. They felt a little more sympathetic than in the first one. I thought Harrison Ford was great. A lot of people were kind of surprised by his not outbreak performance, but more, more different performance than he's given in quite some time. So I thought that was refreshing too. But yeah, just really for the visuals alone, I would recommend seeing this movie. But there's so much more to it than that. Ryan Gosling's character is great as the lead. He has an amazing story arc where he just kind of it's very much like a hero's journey where he just kind of starts out at a low point, and he rises up and has this huge revelation by the end. So that alone is definitely worth seeing. The storytelling in this movie is masterfully done. Denis Villeneuve has done it again, and especially after seeing Arrival, I was definitely thinking that yes, he could tackle another thought-provoking sci-fi film, and he definitely did. If there's one negative thing I could say about the movie that isn't really even, critique of the movie itself, it's more of just kind of like an unfortunate truth, is that this movie did not do extremely well at the box office. And I don't think it will continue to do extremely well, simply because it's a 2 hour and 40-minute sequel to a movie that a lot of people find boring and slow. And yes, this movie itself is slow too. I can see a lot of people going to see this movie, going in expecting some sci-fi action film, but it's really not. It's as far away from that as you can get, really. It's very slow. It relies a lot on atmosphere. There's not much action in it. The little action that is in it is entertaining, but it does not rely on it at all. So it's unfortunate that this movie won't really have a huge audience, but it will find its audience, because I do think people are already recognizing how great this movie is, not only as a sequel, but a standalone film as well. I highly recommend you guys go see this film. It's thought-provoking, it's emotionally investing, emotionally pleasing and satisfying, and also just, it's great to support a visionary director like Denis Villeneuve, and obviously Roger Deakins' great visuals too. So there's a lot for this movie, pushing it and raising it up to be as good as it is. So please go see this movie. Don't let the long runtime or slow pace be a turnoff for you, because it really is an astounding film. I highly enjoyed it, and I think you all will too. So yeah, give this movie a chance. Go see it, because I really think you'll like it. But yeah, as always, guys, thank you for watching, and until next time, stay tuned.